When I collapsed on the graduation stage, the last thing I saw was a sea of proud families rising to their feet, just not mine. 1 second, I was standing there in my navy cap and gown, clutching the diploma I had worked for long years for, scanning the crowd for familiar faces, and the next, everything tilted. The applause blurred into a distant hum. My vision narrowed. Then it all went dark. When I came to, the bright lights above me weren't from the auditorium anymore. They were hospital lights, cold, steady, unforgiving. I remember the faint beeping of a monitor, the crisp smell of antiseptic, and the quiet murmur of voices that didn't belong to anyone who knew me. A nurse noticed my eyes flutter open and leaned in gently. "You're awake," she said, her voice calm, practiced. "You fainted during the ceremony. We brought you in just to be safe." I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry, like I hadn't had water in days. My first instinct wasn't fear. It was expectation. My parents, I managed, barely above a whisper. She gave me a small, reassuring nod. "We called them." There was a pause. A brief one, but long enough for something inside me to tighten. "They're on their way?" I asked, even though her expression had already started to shift. She hesitated, just for a second, then looked down at her clipboard before meeting my eyes again. "We weren't able to reach them," she said carefully. "We left messages." Messages. Plural. That meant more than one call. More than one attempt. I stared at the ceiling, letting her words settle in the quiet space between us. It didn't make sense. They knew how important today was. I had reminded them a week ago. The night before. Even that morning, just before I left my apartment. I had pictured them in the stands, my mom waving too enthusiastically, my dad trying to act like he wasn't emotional. That image had carried me through every late night, every exam, every moment I thought I couldn't keep going. I turned my head slightly toward the door, half expecting it to open at any moment. It didn't. Time moved differently in that room. Slow. Measured. The kind of slow that makes every second feel heavier than it should. A doctor came in, introduced himself, asked me a series of routine questions. Did I feel dizzy? Had I eaten that morning? Any history of fainting? I answered automatically, my mind somewhere else entirely. On the empty seats I must have imagined in that crowd. On the phone calls that weren't answered. On the silence that followed. "We'll keep you for observation for a little while," he said, offering a polite smile before stepping out again. The nurse adjusted the blanket over me and gave my shoulder a gentle pat. "Try to rest," she said. Rest. As if rest was possible when something didn't feel right. I kept my eyes on the door. Every footstep in the hallway made my heart lift for a split second, only to settle again when it passed by. I reached for my phone on the small table beside the bed. 2 missed calls, from an unknown number, probably the hospital trying again, and no messages from my parents. "No, are you okay?" "No, we're on our way." Nothing. I typed out a quick text anyway. "I'm at St. Mary's. I fainted. I'm okay." I stared at the screen after sending it, waiting for those little typing dots to appear. They didn't. Minutes passed. Then more. The room grew quieter, the late afternoon light shifting slightly through the narrow window. And just when I started to feel something heavier than confusion, something closer to realization, I heard footsteps that didn't pass by. They slowed, then stopped right outside my door. I held my breath without meaning to. The handle turned. The door opened. And for a second, I didn't recognize him. Not because I didn't know his face, but because I hadn't expected to see it there. Not today. Not here. My grandfather stood in the doorway, slightly hunched, one hand still gripping the frame, as if he needed a moment to steady himself. He was wearing that same brown jacket he'd had for as long as I could remember, the one with the frayed cuffs and the missing button near the collar. His hair, more silver than gray now, was a little disheveled, like he'd run his hand through it too many times. But his eyes found mine immediately, and in them, there was something I hadn't seen in a long time. Urgency, relief, and something else. Something that made my chest tighten again, but for a different reason. He stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice a little breathless, like he'd been rushing. I pushed myself up slightly against the pillows, my heart suddenly beating faster. "Grandpa." It came out more like a question than a greeting. He moved closer, pulling the chair beside my bed toward him, and sitting down with a quiet exhale. Up close, I could see the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the way his hands trembled just a little as he reached out and took mine. His grip was warm, steady, despite everything else. "You gave us quite a scare," he said, trying for a light tone that didn't quite land. I swallowed, my throat tightening again. How did you know?" I asked. Because I hadn't called him. I hadn't called anyone. He glanced down at our joined hands for a moment, then back up at me. That hesitation again. That same brief pause I'd heard in the nurse's voice. "The hospital called," he said. They went down the list. The list. Of course. Emergency contacts. I had filled that out years ago, back when things were different. Back when I didn't think twice about who would show up if something went wrong. I nodded slowly, processing that. "Mom and Dad." I started, not even sure how to finish the sentence. He didn't let me. His thumb brushed gently over the back of my hand, a small, grounding gesture. "They know," he said quietly. Not unkindly. Not with anger. Just with certainty. I blinked, the words sinking in slower than they should have. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He held my gaze, and for a moment, the room felt even quieter than before. "They knew about today," he said. "And they knew about this." He nodded slightly toward the 4 in my arm, the monitor beside me. He stopped, searching for the right words, then shook his head almost imperceptibly. "They didn't come." And just like that, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough that I felt it. The kind of shift you don't notice until you realize you're not standing where you were before. I looked, past him, back toward the door that had stayed closed for so long. And for the first time since I woke up, I stopped waiting for it to open. I did not cry when my grandfather said those words. And that was the part that surprised me the most, because a part of me had expected something louder, something more dramatic, but instead it felt quiet, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me that I did not even realize I had been holding open all these years. And I just lay there staring at the ceiling again while his hand remained wrapped around mine, steady and warm in a way that made the silence feel less empty, and for a long moment neither of us spoke because there was nothing left to say that would make it different, and yet everything had already changed. The soft hum of the machines filled the space between us, and I became aware of small things I would have ignored before, like the faint ticking of a wall clock somewhere down the hall, the distant sound of a cart rolling across tile, the way the light had shifted slightly toward evening, turning everything in the room a shade softer and more distant, and I realized that this was what it felt like when a moment divided your life into before and after without asking for your permission. My grandfather cleared his throat gently, as if he did not want to disturb whatever I was processing, and when I finally turned my head to look at him again, I noticed just how tired he looked, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered, his shoulders slightly hunched not just from age but from effort, as if simply being here had taken more out of him than he would ever admit. And that thought alone made something twist in my chest in a way that was different from the disappointment I felt toward my parents. Because this was not absence. This was presence. This was someone who had shown up even when it was inconvenient, even when it was difficult. "You should not have rushed like this," I said quietly, my voice steadier now, but still carrying the weight of everything that had just settled in. And he gave a small smile, the kind that did not quite reach his eyes, but still managed to feel genuine. "Of course I should have," he replied, as if the answer was obvious, as if there had never been another option. And that simple certainty made me look away again, because I suddenly did not trust myself to respond without letting something show that I was not ready to show yet. I thought about the messages that had gone unanswered, the empty space where my expectations had been, and for the first time I did not try to fill that space with excuses for them. I did not tell myself they must be busy or that something important had come up, because if there had been something important, they would have said so, and if there had been something urgent, they would have called back, and the absence of those things was its own answer, clear and undeniable. My phone remained on the table beside me, silent, its screen dark, and I did not reach for it again because I already knew what I would find, or rather what I would not find. And there was a strange kind of clarity in that realization, a calm that came not from comfort but from certainty, and it settled over me slowly, like a decision I had not consciously made but could not undo. My grandfather shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his grip on my hand, as if he wanted to make sure I was still there, and I realized that he had probably been sitting like that since he arrived, waiting for me to wake up, waiting to make sure I was all right before allowing himself to relax even a little. And the image of him, driving across town, maybe faster than he should have, maybe skipping whatever he had planned for the day without a second thought, stood in sharp contrast to everything else I had been trying to understand, and it made the difference between showing up and staying away feel even sharper, more defined. Did they say anything? I asked after a while, the question coming out before I had fully decided whether I wanted the answer. And he hesitated again, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing how to say it, and that told me more than the words themselves would have. I spoke to your mother, he said finally, his voice measured, careful. She said she was busy today, and the way he said it, without judgment, without emphasis, somehow made it land heavier than if he had been angry on my behalf, because it meant that this was not new to him either, that he had seen this pattern before even when I had tried not to. I let out a slow breath, not quite a sigh, and turned that sentence over in my mind. Busy today, on the one day that had mattered to me for years, on the one day that had been circled on my calendar since the beginning of the semester, and for the first time I did not feel the need to argue with it. I did not feel the need to defend them or reinterpret it into something kinder, because there was nothing kind about it, and acknowledging that felt like stepping into colder air, uncomfortable but honest. The nurse came back in briefly to check my vitals, her movements efficient and quiet, and she smiled when she saw my grandfather sitting there, as if his presence completed something that had been missing before. And I wondered if she had noticed the absence too, if she had seen enough situations like this to recognize the difference between people who came and people who did not. And when she left again, the room returned to its quiet rhythm, but it did not feel as heavy anymore. I shifted slightly in the bed, testing the strength in my arms, the steadiness of my breath, and everything felt normal enough physically, which only made the rest of it stand out more, because the real imbalance was not in my body, it was somewhere else entirely. You scared me, my grandfather said after a moment, his voice softer now, less guarded, and I looked back at him, noticing the way his eyes searched my face as if he was making sure I was really all right and not just saying that I was, and I nodded slowly. I am okay, I said, and this time I meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the fainting, nothing to do with the hospital, because something had settled into place inside me that I could not ignore anymore. He squeezed my hand gently, a small gesture that carried more reassurance than any words could have, and for a while we just sat there, not needing to fill the silence, not needing to pretend anything was different than it was, and in that quiet, I began to understand that the moment on that stage had not been the collapse that mattered. It had just been the beginning of seeing things as they really were. And once you saw something clearly, you could not go back to pretending you had not seen it at all. I did not ask any more questions after that, not because I did not have them, but because I already knew where they would lead, and instead I focused on the small, steady presence beside me, the quiet certainty of someone who had chosen to be there without hesitation. And as the evening settled in, I began to replay the hours before everything had gone wrong. Not as scattered memories, but as a sequence that suddenly made more sense than it ever had before. 48 hours earlier, I had been standing in my small apartment, the morning light coming through the blinds and thin lines across the kitchen counter, going over a checklist in my head while my coffee grew cold beside me, making sure I had everything ready for graduation day, the gown pressed, the cap adjusted, the shoes that were comfortable enough to stand in for hours, and my phone had been in my hand more than once. My thumb hovering over the message thread with my parents as I typed and retyped simple reminders that should not have needed repeating. The ceremony starts at 10. I had written, then erased it, then written it again, adding, I would really love for you to be there. And I remember staring at that sentence for a moment longer than necessary before finally pressing send, because even then, something inside me had already been bracing for the possibility that it would sit there unanswered. The reply had come hours later, short and distant. We will see. And I had told myself that it was enough, that they were busy, that things had been complicated lately, that there were reasons I just did not fully understand. And I had built a quiet optimism around that fragile response, the kind that depends more on hope than on evidence. The day before graduation, I had called again, pacing slowly across the living room as the phone rang longer than it should have before going to voicemail. And I had left a message that sounded lighter than I felt, telling them I was excited, that it would mean a lot if they could make it, that I would save seats, that I would look for them in the crowd. And even as I said those words, I had pictured the empty spaces where they might not be, pushing that image away as quickly as it came. That night, I laid out my gown across the back of a chair, smoothing the fabric as if that small act of preparation could somehow guarantee that everything else would fall into place. And I remember standing there in the quiet of my apartment, imagining the next day in vivid detail, hearing my name called, walking across the stage, finding their faces in the audience, seeing pride reflected back at me. And I held on to that image as I went to bed, as if it were something solid I could trust. The morning of graduation, my alarm went off earlier than necessary, and I got ready. Slowly, deliberately, making sure everything was exactly right. And before I left, I sent one more message. Leaving now. Hope to see you there. And this time there was no reply at all, just the small delivered mark that felt more final than any words could have been. And still, I told myself that they might be driving, that they might be busy getting ready, that they might surprise me by showing up without warning. And I carried that possibility with me all the way to campus. The parking lot was already filling up when I arrived. Families stepping out of cars with bouquets and cameras, laughter and voices overlapping in a way that felt warm and full, and I walked past them with my gown folded over my arm, trying not to compare, trying not to notice the way parents adjusted their children's collars or took pictures before the ceremony even began. And I found my place with the other graduates, smiling when I needed to, responding when spoken to, but always glancing toward the entrance where the crowd continued to gather, always searching for something familiar that never quite appeared. As we were led into the auditorium, the noise grew louder, applause breaking out in waves as each row of graduates entered. And I remember stepping into that space and feeling both proud and strangely detached at the same time, like I was part of something important, but not fully connected to it. And when I finally reached my seat, I looked out over the rows of faces, scanning slowly, carefully, telling myself not to rush, not to assume. But the more I looked, the clearer it became that the faces I had been hoping to find were not there. I told myself it was just the angle, that maybe they were seated farther back, that maybe they had been delayed. And I held on to that thought even as the ceremony began, even as speeches were given and names were called, even as the reality in front of me remained unchanged. When it was my turn to stand, I felt a sudden rush of heat, a wave of something that was not just nerves, but something deeper, something that had been building quietly all morning. And as I walked toward the stage, I made one last attempt to find them in the crowd, one last sweep of my eyes across the seats. And when I did not see them, something inside me faltered in a way I could not correct. And that was the moment everything began to blur. The applause, the lights, the movement around me, all of it fading into something distant and indistinct until there was nothing left to hold on to. Lying in the hospital bed now, with the memory still sharp in my mind, I understood that the collapse had not come out of nowhere. It had been building long before that moment, in unanswered messages, in postponed plans, in quiet disappointments that I had chosen to minimize. And recognizing that pattern did not bring anger the way I might have expected. It brought clarity, a steady, undeniable understanding that this had not been a single moment of absence. It had been a series of choices, repeated over time, until they became something I could no longer ignore. My grandfather shifted beside me, drawing me back to the present, and I realized that while I had been looking back, he had been there the entire time, not asking for explanations, not offering excuses, just staying. And in that contrast, the difference between what I had hoped for and what was actually real became impossible to overlook. And for the first time, I allowed myself to stop holding on to what I wished had happened and start paying attention to what actually had. It was not just that day, and the more I sat there in that quiet hospital room, the more I began to understand that what happened at my graduation was not an isolated moment. It was simply the first time I had stopped explaining it away, the first time I had let the truth stay exactly as it was without softening it into something easier to accept. And once that happened, other memories began to surface with a clarity that felt almost unsettling, like pieces of a puzzle that had always been there but had never been arranged in the right order until now. I thought about my 18th birthday, the one I had spent waiting at a restaurant table for over an hour, watching other families celebrate around me while the waitress refilled my water again and again with a polite smile that slowly turned into quiet sympathy. And when my phone finally buzzed, it had not been an apology. It had been a short message saying they could not make it and that we would celebrate another time, and I had smiled at the screen, told myself it was fine, ordered a small dessert anyway just to make the evening feel complete, and gone home pretending that it had not mattered as much as it did. I thought about the day I moved into my first apartment, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs with the help of a neighbor I had only met that morning, while my parents had promised they would come by later, and later had turned into never, replaced by a quick call that lasted less than 2 minutes and ended with a reminder that I should be grateful for everything they had already done for me. And I had accepted that too, telling myself that independence meant not needing them in ways I secretly still did. I thought about the holidays that had gradually become shorter visits, then rushed dinners, then messages that said they were traveling or busy or dealing with something that could not be postponed, until eventually those days felt less like traditions and more like optional events that I was not always invited to attend, and each time I had adjusted, scaled down my expectations, convinced myself that this was simply what growing up looked like, that distance was natural, that priorities shifted, that it did not mean anything deeper. But sitting there now, with my grandfather's hand still wrapped around mine, I could no longer pretend that these moments were separate. They were connected, part of a pattern that had been forming quietly over years. And recognizing that pattern did not feel like anger at first, it felt like a slow, steady unraveling of something I had built inside myself. A belief that if I was patient enough, understanding enough, accommodating enough, things would eventually return to the way they were supposed to be. My grandfather shifted slightly in his chair, his gaze steady on me, as if he could see the thoughts moving behind my eyes, and I wondered how much he had noticed over the years. How many of those moments he had witnessed from the outside, while I was still trying to make sense of them from within. And that thought led me to another realization, one that settled in quietly but firmly, that he had been there more often than I had fully acknowledged, at small events, at moments that did not seem significant at the time, but now stood out in contrast to everything else. Like the afternoon he had shown up with a toolbox when my sink would not stop leaking, or the time he had driven across town just to drop off groceries when I had mentioned in passing that I had been too busy to shop, never making it a big gesture, never asking for recognition, just showing up in ways that were consistent and real. I looked at him again, really looked this time, taking in the details I had overlooked before, the worn edges of his jacket, the slight tremor in his hands, the quiet patience in the way he sat beside me without needing to fill the silence with unnecessary words. And I realized that while I had been measuring love by expectation, by what I hoped to receive from the people I thought I needed, I had overlooked the kind that was already present, the kind that did not need to announce itself because it was always there. I should have seen it sooner, I said quietly, more to myself than to him, and he shook his head gently, not in disagreement, but in understanding. You saw what you were supposed to see, he replied, his voice calm. Sometimes it just takes time to see the rest. And there was no judgment in his words, no hint that I had done anything wrong by believing in something that had not held up the way I expected it to. The room felt different after that, not lighter exactly, but clearer, as if the air itself had shifted, and I found myself sitting a little straighter, breathing a little more evenly, not because everything was suddenly resolved, but because I was no longer trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. My phone remained silent on the table beside me, and this time, I did not feel the urge to check it, because I understood now that waiting for a message that might never come was not going to change what had already happened, and for the first time, I allowed that silence to exist without trying to fill it, without trying to interpret it into something less painful than it was. The doctor returned briefly, mentioning that I would likely be discharged later that evening if everything remained stable, and I nodded, listening but not fully focused on the details, because my attention had shifted inward, toward the quiet decisions forming in the background of my thoughts, decisions that did not feel rushed or reactive, but steady and deliberate, like something that had been building long before this moment, and was only now ready to take shape. As the doctor left, my grandfather squeezed my hand again, a small, grounding gesture that brought me back to the present, and I met his gaze with a clarity I had not felt before, not just about what had happened, but about what it meant. And while I did not say anything yet, I knew that whatever came next would not be about trying to fix what had been broken. It would be about deciding what I was willing to carry forward and what I was finally ready to leave behind. The idea that I did not have to keep waiting settled into me slowly, not like a sudden decision, but like something that had been forming quietly in the background for a long time. And now that I could finally see it clearly, it felt almost strange that I had not recognized it sooner. And as I sat there in that hospital bed, with the steady presence of my grandfather beside me and the absence of everyone else no longer something I was trying to explain away, I realized that for the first time, I was not thinking about what I needed from them. I was thinking about what I was willing to accept. And those two things were not the same. My grandfather shifted slightly in his chair, stretching his back as if he had been sitting there longer than he should have, and I noticed the small wince he tried to hide, the way he adjusted his position carefully before settling again. And that simple moment made something inside me tighten, because I understood what it had taken for him to be here, not just the drive or the time, but the choice, the immediate, unquestioned decision to come when it mattered. And I realized that while I had spent years hoping for that kind of response from my parents, I had been overlooking the fact that I already had it from someone else. "You did not have to stay this long," I said quietly, though I already knew what his answer would be. And he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more meaning than the words themselves. "I was not going anywhere," he replied, as if that was the most natural thing in the world, and maybe for him, it was. I glanced at my phone again, not because I expected anything different, but because habits are hard to break. And the screen lit up exactly the way I knew it would, empty of anything new. No missed calls, no messages, just the same silence that had followed me throughout the day. And this time, instead of feeling that familiar pull to fill it with excuses, I simply set the phone back down and let it be, because the silence itself was no longer confusing. It was clear, and that clarity, while not comforting, was steady in a way that confusion had never been. "What are you thinking about?" my grandfather asked after a moment, his voice gentle but attentive, and I considered the question carefully before answering, because for once, I did not want to respond with something automatic or easy. I wanted to say what was actually true. "I think I have been waiting for something that was never going to happen," I said finally, my voice calm but firm, and he nodded slowly, not in agreement exactly, but in understanding, as if he recognized the weight of that realization without needing to add anything to it. The room was quiet again after that, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not the heavy silence of uncertainty, but something more grounded, more settled, and I found myself sitting up a little more, adjusting the blanket around me as if I was preparing to move forward rather than remain where I had been. The doctor returned once more, explaining that my tests looked normal and that I could be discharged within the next hour if I felt ready. And I nodded, listening carefully this time, asking the necessary questions, responding in a way that felt more present than before. And when he left, I turned back to my grandfather with a small, steady breath. "I think I am ready to go home," I said, and even as I said it, I realized that the word home did not feel the same as it had before. It no longer automatically included the people I had been waiting for. It was something I would have to define differently now. My grandfather stood slowly, offering his hand to help me sit up fully, and I accepted it without hesitation, feeling the strength in his grip despite the slight tremor. And as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, I noticed how stable I felt, not just physically, but in a way that extended beyond that, like something inside me had shifted into place. As the nurse came in to finalize the paperwork, I listened carefully, signing where needed, answering questions with clarity, and when everything was done, I reached for my phone one last time, not to check for messages, but to turn it off completely, because for the first time, I did not want to be interrupted by something that might or might not come. I wanted the quiet to remain exactly as it was. We walked slowly down the hallway together, my grandfather keeping his pace matched to mine, not rushing, not hovering, just present. And as we stepped outside into the cool evening air, I took a deeper breath than I had all day, feeling the difference between being inside that room and stepping into something open and uncertain. And yet somehow, it did not feel overwhelming. It felt honest. The parking lot was quieter now than it had been earlier, the day already winding down. And as we made our way toward his car, I found myself glancing back once, not at the hospital itself, but at the idea of everything I had left behind in that room, the waiting, the hoping, the quiet excuses I had carried for so long, and I realized that I was not taking those things with me this time. I was leaving them exactly where they belonged. My grandfather opened the passenger door for me, a small gesture he had done countless times before, and as I settled into the seat, he closed it gently before walking around to the driver's side. And when he started the engine, he did not say anything right away. He just let the quiet settle between us again, and I was grateful for that, because I did not need words to understand what this moment meant. I did not need explanations or reassurances. I only needed to recognize what was already clear. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I looked ahead instead of back, watching the road stretch out in front of us. And for the first time that day, I was not wondering who might still show up. I was thinking about what I would do next, and that shift, small as it seemed, felt like the beginning of something I had not allowed myself to consider before. A life that was not built around waiting for someone else to choose me, but around the choices I was finally ready to make for myself. The drive back felt longer than it should have, not because of traffic or distance, but because for the first time in a long while, I was not filling the silence with expectations, and that silence had a different weight now. Not heavy, not empty, just honest. And I sat there looking out the window as the streetlights passed one by one, their glow stretching across the windshield in quiet intervals. And I realized that I was not checking my phone, not wondering if it would suddenly light up with an apology or an explanation that would make everything easier to accept, because deep down, I already knew that even if a message came, it would not change what had already been made clear. My grandfather kept both hands on the steering wheel, his posture steady, his focus on the road, and every now and then he would glance over at me, not to ask questions, not to fill the silence, but just to make sure I was still all right. And that kind of attention felt different from anything I had been waiting for earlier, because it did not come with conditions or delays. It was simply there. "Do you want to stop somewhere to eat?" he asked after a while, his voice casual, like he was asking about something ordinary. And I thought about it for a moment, not because I was hungry, but because the question itself reminded me of something simple, something normal, something that had nothing to do with disappointment or absence. "Maybe later," I said, and he nodded without pressing, accepting the answer as it was. And that small exchange felt more grounding than I expected. As we turned onto the street where my apartment was, I felt a slight shift in my chest, not anxiety, not exactly, but awareness, because this was where everything would become real again, where I would step back into the life I had been living before that day. Only now it would not feel the same. And I understood that there was no going back to the version of myself who kept waiting for something that had never truly been there. He pulled into the parking lot slowly, turning off the engine with a soft click, and for a moment, neither of us moved, the quiet settling around us once more, and I realized that I did not want to rush this part either, because this was the moment where everything shifted from realization into action, even if that action was small. "You sure you are going to be okay here?" he asked, his voice steady but careful, and I turned to look at him fully, noticing again the lines in his face, the quiet concern that he did not try to hide, and I nodded, not because everything was resolved, but because I knew that I was no longer standing in the same place I had been before. "I will be," I said, and this time the words felt different. They felt like a decision rather than a hope. He gave a small nod, accepting that answer the same way he had accepted everything else, without questioning it, without trying to change it. And he stepped out of the car to walk me to the door, something he had done countless times before, but tonight it carried a different meaning, because I understood what it meant to have someone show up all the way through. Not just at the beginning, not just when it was convenient, but until the moment was complete. As we reached my apartment door, I paused with my hand on the handle, feeling the quiet settle again, and I turned back to him. "Thank you," I said, and the words felt simple, but they held more weight than I could fully express. And he gave a small smile, the kind that did not need elaboration. "You do not have to thank me for that," he replied, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, and maybe for him it was, but for me, it was something I had spent too long expecting from the wrong people. I stepped inside, the familiar space greeting me with the same quiet stillness as before, but it felt different now, not empty, not lacking, just mine, and I set my bag down slowly, taking in the details I had overlooked earlier that morning. The chair where I had laid out my gown, the small kitchen counter where my coffee cup still sat, untouched. Everything exactly as I had left it, and yet not the same at all. My grandfather lingered at the doorway for a moment before heading back to his car, and I watched him go, not with worry, but with a quiet understanding of what had just been proven, something that did not need to be questioned or tested, because it had already been shown clearly. Once the door closed, the silence inside the apartment settled around me again, but this time, it did not feel like something I needed to escape from. It felt like something I could finally sit with without trying to change it, and I moved through the space slowly, taking off my shoes, setting things in place, each small action grounding me further into the present moment. I picked up my phone from my bag, turning it back on after having shut it off earlier, and the screen lit up with a brief delay before returning to its usual state, and for a second, I just looked at it, not expecting anything, not hoping for anything, just observing. And when the notifications appeared, they were exactly what I anticipated: a missed call from my mother and a short message that read, "We heard something happened. Call when you can." And I stared at those words for a moment longer than necessary, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed everything I had already understood: the timing, the distance, the lack of urgency, all of it fitting into the pattern I could no longer ignore. I did not open the message right away. I did not call back. I did not rush to respond, because for the first time, I did not feel the need to react immediately. I felt the need to think, to decide what I actually wanted to say rather than what I had always said before. And that pause, small as it seemed, felt like the beginning of something important, something that would not be undone by a single message or a single moment, but would shape everything that came next in a way I had not allowed myself to consider until now. I did not respond to the message that night. And that was the first time I had ever chosen silence over explanation, the first time I did not rush to smooth things over or make it easier for them to step back into my life as if nothing had happened. And I set my phone down on the kitchen counter, face down this time, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I already knew, and knowing meant I did not have to keep checking. The apartment felt still around me, but it was a different kind of stillness now, not the kind that made me feel alone, but the kind that gave me space to think without interruption. And I walked slowly through the rooms, taking in the small details again: the folded gown on the chair, the unopened mail on the table, the quiet order of a life that had been moving forward even when I felt like I was standing still. And I realized that nothing here had changed except the way I was looking at it. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the faint movement of cars in the distance, their headlights passing in steady lines, and I let my thoughts settle into something more focused, less reactive, because for the first time, I was not trying to decide how to respond to them. I was trying to decide what I actually wanted moving forward, and that difference mattered more than I had ever allowed it to before. The message they had sent stayed in my mind, not because of what it said, but because of what it did not say. There was no urgency, no apology, no sense that they understood the weight of the moment they had missed, and that absence of understanding felt just as clear as everything else I had noticed that day. And it made something inside me shift further into place, something quieter but stronger than anything I had felt before. I picked up my phone again, not to call them, but to open the message and read it one more time. "We heard something happened. Call when you can." And I read it slowly, carefully, as if seeing it differently might change its meaning. But it did not. It remained exactly what it was: distant, neutral, almost casual. And I realized that this was how they saw it, not as a moment that had mattered deeply to me, but as an event that could be addressed later, when it was convenient, when it fit into their schedule. And that realization settled over me with a clarity that did not leave room for doubt. I locked my phone and set it aside again, this time without hesitation, and I moved to the chair where my graduation gown was draped, running my hand lightly over the fabric, feeling its smoothness under my fingertips. And for a moment, I allowed myself to think about what that day was supposed to represent: not just the ceremony, not just the diploma, but the years behind it, the effort, the persistence, the quiet determination that had carried me through every challenge. And I realized that none of that had been diminished by their absence. None of it had been taken away. It still belonged to me, fully and completely, regardless of who had been there to witness it. I folded the gown carefully, more carefully than I needed to, and placed it on the table, not as something unfinished, but but as something complete, something that did not require their acknowledgement to have meaning. And as I stepped back, I felt a quiet sense of closure that I had not expected to find so soon. The room remained quiet, and I found myself sitting down at the table, my hands resting lightly on its surface. And I began to think not about what had already happened, but about what I would do next. And that question did not feel overwhelming the way it might have before. It felt open, like something I had the right to answer on my own terms. I thought about calling my grandfather, about thanking him again, about telling him how much it had meant that he was there, but I knew that he already understood that without needing to hear it repeated. And there was something comforting in that, something steady and reliable that did not need constant affirmation to remain true. I thought about my parents, about the way I had always adjusted myself to fit into the space they left, about the way I had minimized my expectations so that their absence would not feel as sharp, and I realized that I did not want to keep doing that. Not anymore. Not after everything that had become clear. I stood up again and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room, opening the drawer where I kept my notebooks, and I pulled one out, flipping it open to a blank page, and for a moment, I just looked at it, the clean space waiting for something to be written, something intentional, something chosen, and I picked up a pen, not entirely sure what I was going to write, only that I needed to put something down that belonged to me, not to them. Not to the expectations I had carried for so long. The words came slowly at first, not as a full sentence, but as fragments, small pieces of thought that I had not fully formed until now. And I wrote them without overthinking, without trying to make them perfect, just letting them exist as they were. I am not waiting anymore. And I paused, looking at that line, feeling its weight settle in a way that felt both unfamiliar and right. And I added to it, I am choosing what stays. And as I wrote those words, I realized that this was the beginning of something I had not allowed myself to consider before, a way of living that was not defined by who showed up and who did not, but by what I decided to carry forward. I closed the notebook gently and set it aside, not as something finished, but as something started, and I looked around the apartment one more time, not searching for anything, just taking in the space as it was, and, for the first time, it did not feel like a place I had been waiting in. It felt like a place I could move forward from, and that distinction, subtle as it was, changed everything. The words I had written the night before stayed with me longer than I expected, not because they were dramatic or complicated, but because they were simple and clear in a way that I had not allowed myself to be before. And when I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was not my phone, not the messages I had not answered, but the quiet sense that something had already shifted. Something that did not need to be confirmed by anyone else. The sunlight coming through the window felt different, not brighter exactly, but more defined, like everything in the room had sharper edges. And as I sat up slowly, I realized that I was not replaying the previous day in the same way. I was not asking the same questions or searching for different interpretations. I was simply remembering it as it had been, without trying to change it into something else. My phone was still on the table where I had left it, and for a moment, I just looked at it, not with anticipation, but with a kind of distance, because I already knew that whatever was on it would not alter the understanding I had reached. And when I finally picked it up, the screen lit up with more notifications than before, missed calls, a few messages, all from the same number, and I opened them slowly, reading each one without rushing. Call me when you wake up. We need to talk. Why are you not answering? And the tone had shifted slightly, from casual to impatient, but still missing something important. Still missing the acknowledgement that would have made any of it feel different. I set the phone down again, not with frustration, but with certainty, because the pattern was clearer now than it had ever been. And clarity, I realized, does not always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like a quiet finality, like a door that is already closed even if you have not yet turned the handle. I moved through my morning slowly, making coffee, opening the window to let in fresh air, going through small routines that grounded me in the present, and with each simple action, I felt more certain that I was not going to return to the way things had been before, not because I was trying to prove something, but because I could no longer ignore what I had seen. As I sat at the table with my notebook open in front of me, I turned to the page I had written the night before, reading the words again. I am not waiting anymore. I am choosing what stays. And this time, they felt less like a statement and more like a direction, something that required action, not just understanding. I thought about what that action looked like, not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that required confrontation or explanation, but in the quiet decisions that shape everyday life, the choices about who I would call, who I would make time for, who I would allow into the spaces that mattered to me. And for the first time, I realized that I had more control over those choices than I had ever allowed myself to believe. My phone buzzed again on the table, the sound breaking the quiet, and I glanced at it briefly, seeing my mother's name appear once more, and this time, I did not feel the immediate urge to answer. I felt something else, something steadier, and I let it ring, watching the screen until it went dark again, and that small act, simple as it was, felt like a confirmation of everything I had begun to understand. I closed the notebook and stood up, moving toward the closet where I had placed my graduation gown the night before, and I took it out again, not to wear it, but to look at it differently, to see it not as something tied to a moment that had gone wrong, but as something that represented everything I had accomplished on my own, everything I had carried forward without needing anyone else to validate it. And I folded it carefully once more before placing it in a box, not as something to hide away, but as something to keep, something that belonged to me regardless of who had been there to witness it. As I set the box on the shelf, I felt a quiet sense of completion, not just about the graduation, but about the expectations I had attached to it. And I realized that letting go of those expectations did not diminish the moment. It allowed me to see it more clearly for what it was, something I had earned, something I had lived through, something that did not need to be shared in order to have value. The rest of the morning passed without urgency, and I found myself making decisions I had been putting off for weeks, organizing small things, planning next steps, thinking about opportunities that I had hesitated to pursue before, and with each decision, I felt more aligned with the direction I had begun to set for myself, not based on what others expected or what I hoped they might do, but based on what I knew was right for me. Around midday, my phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a message from my grandfather, simple and direct. "How are you feeling today?" And I felt a small, genuine smile form without thinking, because that question carried something different, something real, and I picked up the phone without hesitation, replying honestly, "I am okay." And for the first time, that answer did not feel like something I was saying to reassure someone else. It felt like something I knew to be true. I set the phone down again and looked around the apartment, taking in the quiet, the stillness, the sense of space that no longer felt like something to fill. And I understood that what had begun the day before was not just about recognizing what was missing. It was about recognizing what remained, what had always been there, and what I was finally ready to build on. And as I moved forward into the rest of the day, I carried that understanding with me, not as something heavy, but as something steady, something that would shape every choice I made from that point on. After I ended the call, I did not move right away. I just stood there in the quiet of my apartment, the phone still in my hand, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into something steady and undeniable. And it was not the kind of weight that pulled me down. It was the kind that grounded me, the kind that made everything feel more defined, more certain, like I had finally stepped out of something that had been shaping me without my permission for far too long. I placed the phone back on the table carefully, not with hesitation, not with second thoughts, but with intention, because for the first time, I was not wondering if I had said the right thing. I knew I had said exactly what needed to be said, and that clarity felt unfamiliar but right. The apartment was quiet again, but it was no longer the same quiet I had known before. It did not carry the expectation of interruption. It did not feel like a pause between moments of waiting. It felt complete on its own, and I moved through it slowly, taking in the space as if I was seeing it for the first time, not as a place I had been filling with hope for someone else to arrive, but as a place that belonged entirely to me. I walked to the window and looked out over the street below, watching people move through their own routines, cars passing, lights changing, everything continuing without hesitation, and I realized that nothing about the world outside had shifted. Only my place within it had, and that shift was enough to change everything. My thoughts returned briefly to the conversation, not in a way that replayed it over and over, but in a way that acknowledged it as a turning point, because I understood now that I had not just responded differently. I had changed the pattern entirely. I had chosen not to accept the same explanations, not to adjust myself to fit the same absence. And that choice, simple as it seemed, carried more impact than any argument or confrontation ever could. I moved back to the table and opened my notebook again, turning to a new page, and for a moment, I just looked at it, the blank space, waiting without expectation, and I picked up the pen with a sense of purpose that felt quiet but firm, and I began to write, not because I needed to process what had happened, but because I wanted to define what came next. I wrote slowly, deliberately, letting each word settle before moving to the next. I will not make space for people who do not make space for me. And I paused, reading the sentence over, feeling its meaning settle deeper than anything I had written before, and I added another line beneath it. I will not explain my worth to people who choose not to see it. And as I wrote those words, I felt something align inside me in a way that was both unfamiliar and completely right, because for the first time, I was not writing from a place of reaction, I was writing from a place of decision. I closed the notebook again and set it aside, not needing to add anything more, because what I had written was enough. It was clear, it was complete, and it did not require anyone else to agree with it in order to be true. The rest of the afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm, and I found myself moving through small tasks with a sense of focus that had been missing before, organizing things I had been putting off, making notes about opportunities one wanted to pursue, thinking about what I wanted my next steps to look like now that I was no longer shaping them around someone else's absence. At one point, my phone buzzed again, a new message appearing on the screen, and I glanced at it briefly, seeing my father's name this time. And for a moment, I considered whether to open it right away, but I chose not to, not because I was avoiding it, but because I understood that it did not need to interrupt what I was doing. It did not need to take priority over the direction I had already set. Instead, I continued what I was doing, letting the message sit there until I was ready to look at it on my own terms. And when I finally picked up the phone later, I opened it. Without urgency, reading the words slowly, "We should talk about what happened. This is getting out of hand." And I felt that same steady clarity settle over me again, because even now, the focus remained the same, not on what I had experienced, not on what had been missed, but on the fact that I had responded differently than expected, and that difference was what they were reacting to, not the event itself. I locked the phone again without replying, not out of defiance, not out of anger, but out of understanding, because I knew that continuing the conversation in the same way would only pull me back into the same pattern, and I was no longer willing to do that. As the evening approached, the light in the apartment shifted again, softening into something calmer, and I found myself sitting at the table once more, not because I had something specific to do, but because I felt settled there, grounded in a way that did not depend on anything outside of myself. And I realized that this was what it felt like to move forward without waiting, to exist without constantly adjusting to someone else's choices, and that realization, quiet as it was, felt like the most significant change of all. I did not know exactly what the next conversation would look like, or when it would happen, or how they would respond to the boundaries I had begun to set. But for the first time, I was not focused on that uncertainty. I was focused on what I had already made clear, on what I had already chosen. And that focus was enough to carry me forward without hesitation, because I understood now that the most important part of this was not how they responded. It was that I had finally stopped responding the way I always had before. The evening settled into a quiet that felt earned rather than empty, and I noticed how different it was from the kind of quiet I used to fill with second-guessing. Because now there was nothing left to question, only choices to make, and I sat at the table with my hands resting lightly on the surface, letting that realization settle deeper, not rushing it, not trying to move past it too quickly, because for the first time, I understood that clarity needed space to become something real. My phone remained where I had placed it earlier, screen dark, silent, no longer pulling my attention the way it used to, and I found myself not wondering what might come next from them, but whether I even wanted it to, because the idea of returning to the same cycle felt distant now, like something I could see clearly from the outside instead of being caught inside it. After a while, I stood up and walked toward the small shelf near the wall, the one where I kept a few framed photos and scattered reminders of different moments, and I paused there, looking at them more carefully than I had in a long time, noticing how many of those memories were built around times when I had been trying to hold something together, trying to make moments feel complete even when they were not. And that realization did not bring regret. It brought understanding, because I could see now how much effort I had put into maintaining something that had not been equally supported. I reached for one of the frames, a picture from a holiday a few years ago, all of us standing together, smiling in a way that had felt genuine at the time, and I studied it for a moment, not searching for hidden meaning, not trying to rewrite it, just acknowledging it as it was, a moment that existed but did not define everything that came after, and I set it back down gently, not with rejection, but with a quiet sense of separation, because I no longer needed to hold on to it in the same way. The room felt steady around me, unchanged but different, and I moved back to the table, pulling out my notebook again, not because I needed to process anything new, but because I wanted to continue the direction I had started, to turn understanding into something that would guide me forward, and I opened to a fresh page, letting the pen rest in my hand for a moment before writing. I decide what has access to me. I wrote slowly, the words forming with intention, and I paused after that line, letting it settle fully, because it was not just a thought, it was a boundary, one I had never clearly defined before, and I added another line. Beneath it, access is not automatic, it is earned and maintained. And as I wrote those words, I felt the weight of them in a way that was both new and necessary, because they shifted the way I saw every interaction, every expectation, every moment where I had previously assumed that I needed to be available regardless of how I was treated. I closed the notebook again and leaned back slightly in the chair, taking a slow breath as I let everything settle into place, not forcing anything, not rushing ahead, just allowing the quiet certainty to remain. My phone buzzed again, breaking the stillness briefly, and this time, I did not even look at it right away, because I knew that whatever message had come through would follow the same pattern, the same tone, the same lack of understanding that I had already recognized, and after a few seconds, I picked it up calmly, glancing at the screen without urgency, seeing another message from my father, longer this time, more detailed, explaining schedules, obligations, reasons that were meant to justify their absence, and I read it once, slowly, not to analyze it, not to argue with it, but simply to see it clearly, and when I finished, I felt no pull to respond, no need to correct or explain, because I understood now that the explanation was not what had been missing. It was the choice to be present, and that was not something that could be rewritten after the fact. I set the phone down again without replying, and instead of feeling the usual tension that would follow, I felt something else, something steadier, something that confirmed I was no longer participating in the same dynamic, and that shift, quiet as it was, felt like the most meaningful change I had made so far. The night continued without interruption, and I found myself moving through it with a sense of calm focus, not distracted by what might come next from them, not waiting for a different outcome, because I had already accepted the one that existed, and that acceptance allowed me to direct my attention elsewhere, toward the things that were actually within my control, the decisions I could make, the direction I could choose. As I prepared to go to bed, I paused for a moment by the window again, looking out at the quiet street below, the same view I had seen countless times before, and I realized that while nothing out there had changed, everything inside me had shifted in a way that could not be undone, because I was no longer measuring my life by who showed up when I needed them. I was measuring it by how I showed up for myself, and that difference, subtle as it might seem, had changed the way I saw everything. I turned off the light and let the room settle into darkness, not with uncertainty, not with unresolved questions, but with a sense of clarity that felt complete in its own way. And as I lay down, I did not replay the day or the conversations. I did not imagine different outcomes or different responses. I simply let the quiet remain, knowing that when morning came, I would not be stepping back into the same place I had left behind. I would be moving forward from a place I had finally chosen for myself. Morning came quietly, without urgency, without the weight I used to carry into a new day. And for a moment, I lay there staring at the ceiling, noticing how different it felt to wake up without immediately reaching for my phone, without checking for messages that might pull me back into something I had already chosen to leave behind. And instead, I let the stillness remain, letting the awareness of where I was settle fully before I moved at all. The light coming through the window was soft, steady, and I sat up slowly, taking a breath that felt deeper than usual, not because anything outside had changed, but because something inside me had finally aligned in a way that made everything feel clearer, more grounded, more real. I moved through my morning without rushing, making coffee, opening the window, letting the air fill the space in a way that felt clean and uncomplicated. And as I stood there looking out at the same street I had seen every day before, I realized that I was not looking for anything anymore, not waiting for something to appear, not hoping for a different version of what had already been shown to me. And that realization did not feel empty. It felt complete. My phone remained on the table, untouched, and when I finally picked it up, it was not with hesitation or anticipation. It was simply because I chose to, and I unlocked the screen, seeing the same messages. Still there, unchanged, waiting for a response that I now understood I did not owe in the way I once believed I did. And for a moment, I just looked at them, not with emotion, not with conflict, but with a kind of distance that allowed me to see them for exactly what they were, nothing more and nothing less. I did not delete them. I did not respond. I simply set the phone back down. Because the most important part of this was not what I did with those messages, it was what I did with myself. Moving forward. And that clarity stayed with me as I walked through the apartment, noticing how everything felt more intentional, more defined, like each small action belonged fully to me instead of being shaped by what I was waiting for from someone else. I paused by the shelf again, looking at the framed photos one more time, not with the same perspective I had the night before, but with something steadier, something more resolved. And I understood that those moments would always exist. They would always be part of my story, but they would not define the direction I was choosing now. And I adjusted one of the frames slightly, not as a symbolic gesture, but as something simple and present, something that reflected the way I was no longer holding on to things in the same way. The quiet of the apartment no longer felt like something that needed to be filled. It felt like something I could move within freely. And I found myself sitting down at the table again, opening my notebook. Without hesitation, turning to a new page, and this time, the words came more easily, not because I had rehearsed them, but because they were already clear in my mind. I moved forward without waiting for permission. I wrote, and I paused, letting the sentence settle, feeling its weight in a way that felt steady and certain, and I added another line beneath it. I build my life with the people who show up, and as I finished writing, I closed the notebook gently, not needing to add anything more, because those words did not feel temporary. They felt final in the best possible way, like something I would carry with me without needing to question it again. The rest of the day unfolded quietly, but not aimlessly. I found myself taking steps I had been putting off, sending emails, organizing plans, reaching out to people who had consistently been present in my life. And each of those actions felt different now, not like obligations, not like attempts to fill space, but like intentional choices that reflected the direction I had decided to move in. And with each step, I felt more aligned with that direction, more certain that I was no longer going to return to the place I had been before. At one point, my phone buzzed again, and I glanced at it briefly, seeing another message from my parents. But this time, it did not interrupt anything. It did not shift my focus. It simply existed, separate from what I was doing, and I left it there, because I understood now that not every message required a response, not every call required an answer, and that understanding was not about distance. It was about boundaries, boundaries that I had never clearly set before, but now felt natural, necessary, and completely my own. As the afternoon light began to soften, I found myself standing by the window again, looking out at the same street, the same movement, the same world that had continued without pause, and I realized that while nothing out there had changed, everything inside me had, and that change was not something that could be undone or ignored. It was something I would carry forward in every decision, every interaction, every moment where I chose how to show up for myself. And for the people who truly showed up for me, I thought briefly about my grandfather, about the way he had walked into that hospital room without hesitation, about the quiet certainty of his presence, and I felt a small, genuine sense of gratitude settle in, not because it contrasted with what I had lost, but because it reminded me of what I still had, what had always been there, steady and real. I did not know exactly how things would unfold with my parents from this point forward. I did not know what conversations would come next or how they would respond to the boundaries I had set, but for the first time, that uncertainty did not feel like something I needed to resolve immediately. It felt like something that would take shape over time, based on the choices I continued to make and the consistency I was willing to maintain. As the evening approached, I moved through my apartment with a quiet sense of purpose, not rushing, not hesitating, just continuing forward. And when I finally sat down at the table one last time, I realized that the person who had walked into that graduation ceremony expecting to be seen was not the same person sitting here now, because I no longer needed that moment to define me. I no longer needed their presence to validate what I had achieved or who I was becoming. And that realization, simple and steady, felt like the truest form of closure I could have found, not in what had happened, but in what I had chosen to do with it.